Cracks and groans echo across the grasslands of ancient Argentina. Two SUV-sized armadillo combatants line up broadside, like pirate ships ready to fire. One lashes out with the spiked club on his tail. Crack! His rival's armor shatters. This was the sound of the Glyptodont War. Hi, I'm Danielle Dufault, and you're watching Animalogic, and we are definitely talking about Glyptodont Fight Club. You've seen Glyptodonts be called giant armadillos and moved on. You probably assumed that they were built to fight off predators, like saber-toothed cats, but their life was much more complicated than that, and it all seemed to have been evolved for civil war. But how do we know that? And how did these battle adaptations come to be such a big part of their biology? Let's start from the beginning. These giants appeared a little over 35 million years ago, as the rise of the Andes and global cooling caused large swaths of humid forest to open up into dry grassland. They would roam South America until very recently, about 10,000 years ago, when the Quaternary extinction event took them and many other large mammals out. During those 35 million years, Glyptodonts traveled far and wide despite their slow, bulky physique. After the Isthmus of Panama rose from the sea about 3 million years ago, they even made it out of South America and all the way into the southern United States. Glyptodonts weren't just geographically widespread, but also abundant. Because of how hard it is to tell them apart, historically, over 200 species have been described, but several of them have been discovered to be the same species. Today, around 40 species are accepted. Still a lot, but even with all that evidence, hundreds of fossils, there has been a surprising amount of debate about their biology. Some of the earliest records of Glyptodonts in the 1810s mistake the Glyptodont fossils for the remains of giant sloths. Not having many other fossils besides the shells, researchers assumed they belonged to the same animal. If true, it would have been a cool animal. Can you imagine an armored giant sloth? Basically a sloth Blastoise. Charles Darwin collected some Glyptodont fossils during the South American leg of the second voyage of the Beagle in the 1830s, and described the Carapace as a giant cauldron. The similarities with modern armadillos played a part in his development of the theory of evolution. But unfortunately for the Big D, he didn't get dibs on describing these animals. The formal description of those remains by paleontologist Sir Richard Owen, the same guy who came up with the word dinosaur, put them on the map for academics and ignited nearly 2 centuries of debate about the life and times of these bizarre beasts. The most amazing feature of all Glyptodonts is, of course, their carapace. It's built from interlocking bony plates, called osteoderms, that were fused together by tight sutures, the same kind of connection that holds the bones of our skulls together. The exact tiling pattern of the osteoderms varied between fossils. Historically, paleontologists used those patterns to categorize different species, which was sort of correct. But as more Glyptodonts have come across their desks, including multiple individuals from the same species, they realize that the carapace might change over the animal's lifetime. For example, some species have layers of spike-like osteoderms around the edge of their carapace only at some point in their life. And some others have the arrangement of their osteoderms change as the animal grows into their shell. This makes it very tough to say if 2 fossils belong to different species, or if they're the same species but just different sexes or ages. But hey, that's still miles ahead of where we started with these carapaces, which was that they belonged on the backs of giant sloths. But if there's one thing we know now about sloths, it's that, like most mammals, they don't have shells. It almost seems silly to think that they thought this, and in many stories of the discovery of Glyptodonts, it's used as a punchline. But the paleontologists were actually much smarter than they usually get credit for. There were some giant sloths with bony scutes, aka osteoderms, that grew directly in their skin. Mylodon, a Patagonian 2-ton giant, was a prime example. So they did have an actual reason to believe the carapaces could have belonged to giant sloths. Since Glyptodonts, like armadillos, are originally South American, paleontologists figured that they belonged to the same evolutionary group, Cingulata. And for the first time so far in this episode, they were right! Modern armadillos are wily little guys with bendy, leathery shells that grow over bony scales called scutes. These scutes don't get fused to one another, but remain loose to give the animal a little extra flexibility. They also have long, sharp claws for digging out grubs. Despite their short legs, they're quite agile animals. Some species can even curl up into a defensive ball in seconds. Glyptodonts were none of those things. The carapace was one solid, inflexible piece, and it alone could weigh hundreds of kilos. Key pieces of their skeleton, like their backbone and pelvis, were fused for added strength and reinforcement. For Glyptodonts, bending, never mind curling into a ball, was mostly impossible. As Glyptodonts changed over time, they doubled and tripled down on their tanky image, sacrificing flexibility and agility for sturdiness to build bigger and thicker carapaces. Doedicurus, one of the last surviving Glyptodonts, had a 2.5 centimeter thick shell and weighed up to 1,500 kilograms, with some particularly large individuals breaking the 2-ton mark, and was as tall as a horse. It also had the most extreme example of Glyptodont's second most famous feature, a tail club. Sometime in the Miocene, mid-20 million years ago, tanky Glyptodonts started experimenting with a new tactic: offense. One of the earliest prototypes came from Propaleohoplophoros, a small Glyptodont that weighed as much as an average person. It had a tail stiffened and reinforced by rings of osteoderms near the tip. Originally, paleontologists thought that these fearsome weapons evolved to fight off predators, like saber-tooth cats, who definitely got their paws in at least one juvenile Glyptodont, based on the very distinct and very painful oval-shaped holes in its skull. And lots of Glyptodonts have gnarly battle scars that tell us they'd seen combat in life. Cracks, missing osteoderm tiles, holes, and even infected bone, probably caused by bacteria invading from the open wound. And just like their carapaces, there are some serious cracks in the simple Saber-Tooth versus Glyptodont story. Saber-tooth teeth were probably too fragile to do much more than scratch the thick carapaces of adult Glyptodonts. Plus, big and slow as they were, Glyptodonts probably didn't have the speed or flexibility to land a blow on an agile predator like saber-tooths. So who was the target of their rage? Probably other Glyptodonts. These weapons and defenses make the most sense as counters to each other. You don't bring a knife to a tank fight, or use a club to take out a fighter jet. We know this because researchers did the math to prove that Glyptodont clubs could strike with enough blunt force to fracture and crush their carapaces. Using models inspired by baseball bats, which rely on similar physical principles to send balls into the outfield, they calculated that big Glyptodonts like Doedicurus could swing their 65-kilogram clubs as fast as 40 kilometers an hour, or 25 miles per hour. It doesn't matter how tough you are, that's going to cause some serious damage. The coolest thing about these clubs isn't so much their raw potential for destruction, but that they existed at all. Glyptodonts are one of only a handful of groups of animals to have evolved tail clubs. The most famous of them are the Ankylosaurids, including a personal favorite of mine, Zool. Glyptodonts and Ankylosaurs, nature's most famous club-bearing tanks, aren't just randomly similar, but an amazing example of convergent evolution, which is when unrelated species develop the same trait based on similar evolutionary pressures. What's surprising about Glyptodonts and Ankylosaurs is that they didn't just end up at the same place, but that they took the same steps to get there, separated by over 300 million years of evolutionary history. It went roughly like this. First, they evolved a combination of herbivory, body armor, and a wide pelvis. Then came strengthening and stiffening of the chest and tail. Finally, and only once everything else was in place to provide structural support, did the tail clubs and spikes come in. From there, Glyptodonts were locked into an arms race with themselves, getting bigger and more dangerous over time. Exactly why they fought each other so much remains mysterious, but our best guess is fighting over mates or territory. And now we get to their third and most underrated adaptation, their heads. Compared to the imposing body armor and elaborate tail weapons, the Glyptodont skulls seem boring, but it may be their most bizarre feature of all. The first thing that jumps out is the shape. Tall, with no trace of the long snout you'd expect in an armadillo relative. The cubish shape comes from telescoping, a process where facial bones slide over and under one another until they overlap, like an old-timey extendable telescope. But telescoping had its consequences. A tall skull has less space for rows of teeth, and less space to spread food out for grinding than a long skull. And that plays into the other major feature of the skull, the big, bony mustache running from under the eye to the jaw. This is the zygomata, or cheekbone. It's where most animals attach their masseter muscles, which power biting and chewing. Based on the size of it, Glyptodonts should have had huge, powerful chewing muscles. But surprisingly, the research suggests that their grinding surfaces were too small, and more often than not, they had to swallow their food just partially ground up. They probably grazed on a variety of grasses. Plants in general, and grasses especially, are terrible food. So terrible that Glyptodonts had to add yet another weapon to their arsenal: weird teeth. Grass is a tough food to eat. It's usually covered in dirt that damages teeth. It takes a lot of grinding and processing to break it down into digestible carbs, and doesn't have a ton of calories. But the trade-off of having those short heads was that they lost dental real estate to chew it. So, to make up for it, they would have to eat a lot of grass to feed themselves, especially if we assume that they, like armadillos, had slow metabolisms. And that's where that last bizarre skull feature comes in: the teeth. Glyptodont teeth look like a mini mountain range, 3 tall peaks with deep valleys between them. They never stop growing to compensate for the wear and tear of grazing. Kinda wish I had Glyptodont teeth. The deep valleys add a ton of surface area, where most mammals sprawl their grinding area into long snouts. Glyptodonts do the opposite, building up super high crowns on their teeth to stack the grinding area upwards. Glyptodont teeth were so special that when Mr. Dinosaur himself came up with a name for these strange animals, he focused not on the carapaces or the tail clubs, but their teeth. The name Glyptodont roughly translates into carved tooth in Greek. Paleontologists were correct and maybe a little lucky to peg Glyptodonts as members of Cingulata, the armadillos, early on. But where exactly in the family tree they fit in was a whole different question. Initially, they thought that they were only distantly related to living armadillos. Their armor, tail clubs, heads, and teeth were just so different that there had to be hundreds of millions of years of evolution between them. Comparing body parts is a key feature of paleontology, and it helps us study extinct animals based on incomplete information. For example, when all we have is a skull, we can make fairly accurate guesses of the animal's lineage by comparing it to skulls of more well-studied animals. But one of the problems with this is that it will sometimes mislead you because of convergent evolution, which might make us think that two animals are more closely related than they actually are. But in this case, it was the opposite. The fact that they are so different from their pink fairy cousins suggested that they were actually less closely related to armadillos than they really were. The breakthrough came about 10 years ago, when not one, but two teams of scientists used molecular techniques to redraw the armadillo family tree. By comparing mitochondrial DNA extracted from Doedicurus to living armadillos, sloths, and anteaters, both teams came to the same conclusion. Glyptodonts aren't just ancient armadillo relatives, but true ancient armadillos. Glyptodonts slot into the middle of the armadillo family tree, closest to the fairy armadillos, Chlamyphorinae. Fairy armadillos are exactly what you expect from their name. Tiny, pink, and have magical powers to make me say, "Aww," every time I see one. But this is pretty much the exact opposite of their hulking, tanky, bone-crushing cousins. Not to say that I don't think they're cute. Aww. This sounds like minor reshuffling, but it recontextualizes a lot of what we knew or thought we knew about Glyptodonts. Based on reconstructions using the new family tree, researchers estimated that the Glyptodont lineage diverged about 34 million years ago. The fairy armadillos kept their ancestors' insect-eating habits, flexible carapace, snout, and peg-like teeth. The Glyptodonts didn't, and over time evolved the bizarre collection of traits that made them famous and weird enough to make us make an episode all about them. Well-deserved, Glyptodonts. Now that we have a better idea of where Glyptodonts started, paleontologists can dig in and better chart how these animals changed over time, and how pressures like climate change and human interference influenced their changes. As you can imagine, and as usual when we talk about animals that went extinct in the past 10,000 years, humans played a big role in these animals' demise. Researchers have found evidence of butchered Glyptodonts, like a Doedicurus who lived as recently as 7,000 years ago and was eaten in an Argentinian swamp. This tracks, as several cultures across the Americas eat armadillos to this day. Glyptodonts spent millions of years perfecting the art of war. First, they built the ultimate defense, and then they invented ways to break through it. But while the Pampas grasslands may no longer rumble with the sound of a clash of Glyptodonts, today we can still find the echoes of the Glyptodonts in living animals. If you want to learn more about the closest living relatives of Glyptodonts, check out our episode about pink fairy armadillos, linked in the description. So, what should we talk about next? Please let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for new episodes every week. Thanks for watching, and see ya!